And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a World Series preview episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks, and I am actually coming to you from Long Grove, Illinois today. I had to make a pit stop out in the suburbs before heading back to the city to watch Game 1 of the Fall Classic tonight, the 2016 World Series. It is Tuesday, October 25th, 2016. And in a couple hours, at about 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern, the American League champion Cleveland Indians will host the National League champion Chicago Cubs from Progressive Field in Cleveland, Ohio. 7-game set. Should be a great series between two long-suffering organizations looking for their first world championships since 1908 for the Cubs, of course, and lesser known for the Cleveland Indians since 1948. On tonight's episode, we're going to discuss the postseason up to date, and I'm going to make my prediction for the World Series. Also, in a separate segment that will be recorded at a later date to be determined, I'm going to give out my regular season awards for Silver Slugger in both leagues, as well as the Gold Gloves in both leagues. So, without further ado, let's get into this evening's podcast. So, to date, as we approach the World Series here within about an hour and 50 minutes of first pitch, the postseason up to this point has been nothing short of very exciting. Both leagues, even though the series have been rather short in the American League, watching the Cleveland Indians play baseball the way they do, I think has been some of the most exciting ball that I've seen in the American League playoffs in quite a while. This is a very enjoyable team to watch because they hit the ball for power. They can run the bases really well. They've got great pitching both from the starting rotation and from their bullpen, and they're a great defensive team as well. Very well managed by Terry Francona. In the first round of the playoffs in the division series, they were up against the Boston Red Sox, who were considered favorites only, in my opinion, because they have the more name players on their ball club and are a more celebrated franchise. Even though I picked the Red Sox initially to win that series, I regretted it immediately because I felt even prior to Game 1 of that series, the matchup actually favored the Indians, even though they were missing Carlos Carrasco and Danny Salazar in their rotation. And even with only having Corey Kluber, Josh Tomlin, and pre-drone accident Trevor Bauer healthy, only having 3 starting pitchers healthy, they essentially cruised to a 3-0 sweep in that series. They knocked around the Red Sox starters. In particular, they were able to do quite a bit of damage off of Rick Porcello in Game 1, and of course David Price, who continues his postseason misery in Game 2, both games at Progressive Field. And the story of the postseason so far for the Indians has been starting pitchers Corey Kluber and Josh Tomlin, and their bullpen led by Andrew Miller, Cody Allen, and Brian Shaw. With those 5 pitchers in particular, they have been responsible. They have factored into almost every win in the postseason for the Indians, with the exception of Bauer, who pitched admirably in Game 1 of the division series on short notice that he would be starting Game 1. And then, of course, he attempted to take the ball in Game 3 in Toronto in the LCS. Didn't pitch very well. And then Ryan Merritt taking the ball in Game 5 of the LCS against the Jays and pitching extremely well in a short 4+ inning start. So the Indians were able to cruise by the Red Sox, out-homering them, out-pitching them, and just overpowering them in 3 games. Then they moved on to the ALCS, where they faced the Toronto Blue Jays. The Blue Jays came off that walk-off victory against the Orioles in the wild card game. Edwin Encarnacion hitting a game-winning home run in, I believe, the bottom of the 11th or the bottom of the 12th against the Orioles. The Jays would then advance to the division series and sweep the Texas Rangers, who had the best record in baseball, or they had the best record in the American League, I should say. They ended up sweeping the Rangers, even without home field. They went down to Arlington, won the first 2 games down there, scored 15 runs in the first 2 games, then came back to the Rogers Center and won in thrilling fashion when Josh Donaldson ended up scoring from second on a ball that never left the infield. So with that matchup set, I believe a number of people were picking the Jays to win that series merely because of their offensive lineup and the fact that they had been to the LCS the year before. Usually in that situation, people tend to favor the team that has the postseason experience to that point. Once again, the Indians, their starting rotation proved it again, and their bullpen was spectacular yet again. The offense wasn't quite as good as it was against the Red Sox, but they still scored enough runs to win that series. They ended up winning in 5 games. Like I said, Corey Kluber pitched really well in Game 1. Josh Tomlin again in Game 2. And then the bullpen really kind of carried them home to an American League pennant with their wins in Game 3 and Game 5. They only got 2/3 of an inning from Trevor Bauer, whose aforementioned injury from fixing a drone in his apartment caused him to slice open his pitching hand, and then his hand bled again, causing him to miss the rest of that ball game in Game 3. But the depth of the Indians' bullpen was able to pick it up and only give up 1 run, basically in about 8 innings of relief. So they were able to win that Game 3, go up 3-0, and then the Jays finally did get to Kluber on 3 days rest in Game 4, but then in Game 5, little-known rookie with only 11 innings of big league experience, Ryan Merritt, not an overpowering lefty by any means, was able to take the words that Jose Bautista used prior to Game 5 and shove it up right where the sun don't shine, essentially. He came out and pitched really well, no runs in 4 1/3 innings. They ended up winning the ball game and advancing to the World Series. And throughout the postseason for the Indians, their bullpen has been spectacular, led by, of course, Andrew Miller, whom they acquired from the New York Yankees at the trade deadline. With Miller being able to pitch 2+ innings an appearance, as Terry Francona has laid that out for him, and he doesn't even come into games in save situations. He'll come in the 5th, 6th, or 7th inning, throw about 40 pitches, and however many outs he can cover in those 40 pitches is exactly what he's going to give the Indians. They like to go with Brian Shaw before him, and they like to have Cody Allen close it out once he's left the ball game. With that being the case, the Indians have consistently been able to cover the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th innings of all these postseason victories that they've had so far. Essentially, if you haven't scored enough runs to take the lead after the 5th against the Tribe this October, your chances of winning are not very good. So with that being the case, going into the World Series, the Indians, I believe they're going to continue to rely on that dominant bullpen. They're going to try to score some runs early. This is a scrappy offensive team led by young superstar shortstop, whom I believe is the best shortstop in baseball now, Francisco Lindor. And then a guy at second base whom I actually got a chance to play against in high school and am tremendously honored to see him play in the World Series, and that's Jason Kipnis from Northbrook, Illinois. He played high school baseball at Glenbrook North High School in Northbrook, Illinois from 2001 to 2005, so he's the same age as me. He's turned into a guy who battled his way up through playing Division I college baseball at the University of Kentucky and Arizona State University. Played 4 years of college, which is extremely rare for an all-star caliber big league player. And then he ended up getting drafted in 2009, and even at the age of 22, he was able to get through the Indians farm system in less than 2 years and end up making it to the big leagues in 2011. And since then, he's been a 3-time All-Star and has been a great player for the Tribe. They've definitely gotten more than they could have asked for from a 4-year college player. So with those two guys up the middle, Mike Napoli hitting 30 homers and driving in 100-plus runs at first base, Jose Ramirez being a very productive offensive and defensive third baseman, Lonnie Chisenhall in right, Tyler Naquin in center, and Rajay Davis, Coco Crisp, among others, playing left. This has turned into a really good all-around Cleveland Indians team. Like I said, they're an excellent defensive team. They put the ball in play. They work the count. They hit the ball out of the ballpark. They've got some speed as well. This is just a really solid all-around ball club. And I think going into the series, a number of media outlets have severely underestimated this ball club. And that's not so much that they don't think highly of the Indians. It's more so that they think extremely highly of the team I'm about to talk about next, the National League champions, the Chicago Cubs. So the Cubs going into this year, they came into the season with a lot of hoopla, a lot of hype. They've been able to, as Joe Madden, their manager, phrased it, embrace the target, and they've taken those projections and predictions that they would win 95, 100 games, and they went out and they won 103 games. They had the best record in baseball. They were the best team in baseball with the most talent all year. They've been led by their great offensive lineup, which features likely MVP award winner Chris Bryant at third base, their stalwart first baseman, perennial all-star Anthony Rizzo, their budding stars up the middle, Addison Russell and Javi Baez. They've got some solid veteran players in Miguel Montero, David Ross. Dexter Fowler in center field has been quietly one of the best players in baseball this year, with a wins above replacement, according to Fangraphs, of 4.7. In other words, that usually if you're above 4.5, close to 5, that means you're a top 20, top 25 player in the entire game. So he's had a great year. They had an excellent call-up in Wilson Contreras behind the plate. And this has been a team throughout the year. Ben Zobrist, another guy, a switch hitter who gets on base a ton, can play a number of different positions. Obviously, Jason Hayward had a disappointing regular season, but he still contributes defensively to this team. And also, their pitching staff. Can't forget about the pitching staff. Kyle Hendricks, Jake Arrieta, and John Lester, of course, John Lester. All three guys have had excellent seasons, with Lester and Arrieta making the All-Star team. Hendricks being a late season, although he was good all year, he really came on in the second half to wedge his way into the Cy Young Award candidate conversation. I believe him and Lester will both have an opportunity to be in the mix for that award when it's given out after this postseason is over. John Lackey has provided some depth and veteran presence in the rotation as well. And then they went out and traded for Aroldis Chapman, who obviously had a very serious off-the-field issue in terms of the domestic violence. I don't know if it was actual criminal charges or not, but that story obviously is a very ugly story. It's a negative thing for the Cubs to have to take on, but he does have a brilliant arm, being able to reach triple digits with that fastball. And then, of course, the manager, Joe Madden, whom, of course, as a White Sox fan, it can be kind of irritating to listen to the amount of nauseating talk about how great the guy is. But he truly is a great manager. He does a terrific job with this team. So they've been really well put together coming into postseason play. And when I come back from a quick break here, I'm going to tell you guys about how the Cubs got to where they are and what the keys will be for them to go ahead and end their 108-year drought with a World Series championship. And welcome back to part 2 of this World Series preview on the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. And in the first segment, we talked about the Indians and their road to the World Series. And we concluded by discussing the Cubs' strengths and weaknesses. Really more so strengths than anything else. I didn't really get into any weaknesses with the ball club. They have had a spectacular season, so it would be really difficult to point out what they've done incorrectly after winning 103 games. But now I'd like to jump into the Cubs' road to the Fall Classic this year. After winning 103 games and having the best record in baseball, of course they had home field throughout the National League postseason. And in the division series, they drew the San Francisco Giants, who of course won in a kind of spectacular fashion in the wild card game against the New York Mets, with unlikely reserve and former White Sox cast-off Conor Gillespie hitting a 3-run homer at Citi Field in the 9th inning off of Yuri's Familia to win that game and send the Giants to the division series. And in Game 1 at Wrigley, Jon Lester and Johnny Cueto was the pitching matchup. Personally, I thought Cueto was going to get lit up because he had such a poor track record in postseason games on the road. I was severely mistaken. He pitched extremely well, but he made one mistake, and that was to Javi Baez in the 8th inning when he hit a solo shot, which happened to be the only run in the game, because as good as Cueto was for those 8 innings, Jon Lester matched him 0 for 0, pitching 8 innings of shutout ball, and then Chapman got the save. The Cubs ended up winning that game 1-0 in Game 1 of the division series. Game 2, the Cubs' bats opened that one up a little bit more against former Cub Jeff Samardzija. Kyle Hendricks had a minor injury which caused him to get removed from the game pretty early, but the Cubs' offense held up, scored enough runs, and then they ended up winning that game as well. So they went up 2-0 against the Giants, heading out to AT&T Park in San Francisco. Game 3 was a pretty wild ball game, as I recall, with the Giants falling behind early when Jake Arrieta hit that 3-run homer, and then the Giants ended up coming back, forcing that game to extras. I believe, actually, they might have blown a lead in the 9th inning. The Giants' bullpen was pretty shoddy all year, and it certainly caught up with them in the postseason, especially in the game that followed. More on that later. But in Game 3, the Giants ended up winning late in extras. I think it went 13 innings, I believe. In that long game, the Giants ended up having to use all of their best relievers to keep that game within striking distance. Madison Bumgarner did not pitch as well as they needed him to. The Cubs ended up scoring some runs off him, so the Giants were forced to use their bullpen in a pretty lengthy manner to keep the series alive. So with the Cubs up 2-1, going into Game 4, Matt Moore pitched Game 4 for the Giants, and he pitched really well. I think he only gave about 2 runs in 8 innings, and he had a 5-2 lead going into the 9th. Then Bruce Bochy probably had, and I think Bruce Bochy is an excellent manager. With 3 World Series rings, he's in the conversation for being in the Hall of Fame, certainly. And he's won 4 pennants because he won a pennant in San Diego. Taking the San Diego Padres to the World Series is an achievement in itself, let alone 3 World Series rings. So he's had a great career, but he probably had the worst inning of his career as a manager in the 9th inning of Game 4. Using 5 pitchers to try to get 3 outs. I think they gave up 5 runs. And when it really swung for me, in my opinion, wasn't with the Bryant leadoff walk, but it was when Javier Lopez put on Anthony Rizzo with a walk. So the first two men walked in that inning, and then the game just broke wide open for Ben Zobrist, Javi Baez. I think that Wilson Contreras got a big hit in that inning as well. It just broke wide open for the Cubs to score 4 or 5 runs. They either took a 6-5 or 7-5 lead. I can't recall the exact number. But they were able to break the lead open, and then Aroldis Chapman came in, got the save, and the Cubs were on to the NLCS. They beat the Giants in 4 games. Then in the NLCS, they faced the Dodgers, who were coming off a thrilling Game 5 victory against the Washington Nationals in their division series. Game 4 of the Cubs-Giants series and Game 5 of the Dodgers-Nats series, in my opinion, are the 2 best games that have been played this postseason. And I'm sure that's about to change at some point in the World Series. So the Dodgers had to basically use their entire pitching staff in that Game 5 in D.C. And the Cubs had a couple days off. They were going to get Lester back to pitch that Game 1. They took advantage. Although the Dodgers did tie the game up in the 9th inning, but then having Joe Blanton in the game to face Miguel Montero, that worked out quite a bit in the favor of Montero as he hit a grand slam off of Blanton, and they gave the Cubs a eventual 8-3 victory and a 1-0 lead in the series. Then in Game 2, great pitchers duel between Kyle Hendricks and the Dodger ace Clayton Kershaw. Kershaw, who had came back to save Game 5 and save the day for the Dodgers against the Nationals only 3 nights before, came out and pitched 7 innings of shutout ball on short rest against the Cubs at Wrigley to get a 1-0 victory on the strength of an Adrian Gonzalez solo shot. So with it being said, a great pitching performance by Kershaw, that meant that the series was tied 1-1 going back to L.A. Then something unexpected happened, in my opinion. I thought that the Cubs would go out and win Game 3 because I liked the Arrieta matchup against the Dodger lineup, and I didn't think that Rich Hill would match up very well against the Cubs, and the exact opposite thing happened. The Dodger lineup jumped on the Cubs, and they jumped on Arrieta, I should say, and then Rich Hill pitched really well against the Cubs lineup. So Dodgers went up 2-1, and at that point I think a number of people actually thought the Dodgers had a pretty good chance to win the series because Julio Urias was pitching, rookie phenom, 20 years old, a lefty power pitcher going for the Dodgers against John Lackey, who had looked a little shaky in his start against the Giants. Didn't really work out that way. Lackey pitched a great game against the Dodgers to get them back even 2-2. The Cubs' bats finally woke up with home runs by Russell and Rizzo in that game, 2 guys that have been struggling all postseason to that point. So it was 2-2 going into Game 5 on Thursday, and that meant that there was going to be a rematch of the Game 1 matchup between Cubs ace John Lester and Japanese rookie Kenta Maeda for the Dodgers. Maeda, it should be of note that he's a rookie and he had come over from the Japanese Pro League over there. He had struggled at the end of the season and into the postseason in his first 2 starts against the Nationals and Cubs. And I think that's primarily because of the 6-man rotation that Japanese teams use, plus there's less travel, and it's a shorter schedule. So you're probably only starting 20 to 25 games with pretty minimal travel by comparison to pitching in the States. So it wasn't a shock to see that he was worn down. I thought the Cubs were going to jump all over him. He kind of held it together, only giving up about 3 runs, but he didn't go that deep in the ball game. And the Cubs bats really busted it open against the Dodger bullpen in the 6th and 7th, 6th through 8 innings in particular. Things got a little dicey once Lester left after the 7th. The bullpen gave up a couple of runs, but the Cubs ended up holding on to take a 3-2 lead after an 8-4 victory out in Chavez Ravine. So, moving back to Game 6 in Chicago, Kyle Hendricks back on the mound. He pitched an incredible ball game, going 7+ innings, I believe, not giving up any runs. The Cubs wasted no time in jumping all over Kershaw in the first inning, with Chris Bryant and Dexter Fowler driving in runs, and them going up 5-0 early in the ball game. They end up winning the game 5-0 and sending themselves to the World Series for the first time since 1945, which is truly incredible. So now you have a team in the World Series for the first time in 71 years, looking to win it for the first time in 108 against a ball club that is in their first World Series in 19 years. That's not a very long time of a pennant drought, but the 68-year World Championship drought is the second longest behind the Cubs. So one long-suffering franchise, one way or the other, will end their streak of futility here in the next week. And with that, I believe now it's time to look at the actual matchup between these two great ball clubs and who has the edge. So I'll start off by talking about the pitching in this series, in particular, the starting pitching. To me, the Cubs have the slight edge because even though I think that Corey Kluber is the best individual pitcher in this series in terms of the starters, the Cubs have the most depth. Being able to roll out John Lester, Kyle Hendricks, John Lackey, and Jake Arrieta, the Indians don't quite have that kind of depth. I believe Danny Salazar is going to start a game in this series. Trevor Bauer's been kind of an up-and-down pitcher. I would trust Salazar more if I knew that he was healthy. The only way we're going to find out is when he goes out there, because he hasn't pitched since September 9th. Like I said, I do think that Kluber is the best pitcher in the series, though. So even though the Cubs definitely have more depth 1 through 4, the greatness of Kluber doesn't quite offset it, but it makes it a lot closer than one would think. So the Cubs get the edge there for the starting pitching. The bullpen, I'm going to give the Indians the edge in this category. Aroldis Chapman, as hard of a thrower as he is, has shown signs of vulnerability at points in the postseason. Surprisingly, left-handed hitters, which I didn't expect from him. At times, Pedro Strop can be a little iffy with his command, and Hector Rondon, he had his issues closing games. I think he's better as a setup man, so I don't expect him to have issues, but if you're going to ask me who's the better setup man, Andrew Miller or Hector Rondon, I'm certainly going to go with Andrew Miller. He's been the MVP for the Indians in the postseason. He's pitched spectacularly in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. Brian Shaw has been an excellent setup man as well. And then Cody Allen has been almost untouchable as a closer. Probably the most underrated arm on the ball club, which is strange to say about a closer that he's the most underrated arm in their bullpen, but I think he is because people have overlooked him because they've been talking about Miller so much. So for me, the edge in the bullpen goes to the Indians. And then with the starting lineups, for me, I would say the Cubs get the edge there with Bryant, Rizzo, Fowler at the top, with the guys in the middle. Zobrist in particular, I expect him to get going at series, as well as Addison Russell, who seems to be swinging the bat better. Once again, I think this is closer than people think, though. I really do like the Indians lineup as well. Carlos Santana is a very unique leadoff man because he's a power and on-base guy. Kipnis and Lindor right after him. Napoli. Then the middle to bottom is pretty tough with Jose Ramirez, Tyler Naquin, Lonnie Chisenhall, Coco Crisp, Rajay Davis. And we'll be right back to conclude this episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. And welcome back to this World Series preview on the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. And in the first 15-minute segment, we spent our time talking about how the Cleveland Indians made it to the postseason. Then in the second segment, we talked about how the Chicago Cubs made their way to the Fall Classic to represent the senior circuit, the National League. Then we talked about how these two teams match up in terms of their starting pitching and their bullpen. And now we're right in the middle of a discussion about their lineups and how they match up. Personally, I think you have to favor the Cubs here because of their depth, their ability to get on base. They've got some excellent young hitters and some veterans. A lot of power in the lineup with Bryant and Rizzo in particular. This is a very talented group that has really driven this team all the way to the World Series. On the Indian side, though, I don't think you can underestimate those guys because they have a pretty versatile lineup in their own right with a power and on-base guy at the top in Carlos Santana, some athleticism and great all-around offensive play in the 2 and 3 hole with Jason Kipnis and Francisco Lindor. The cleanup hitter, Mike Napoli, hit 30-plus homers and drove in 100-plus runs. Jose Ramirez hitting 5th. Then you have guys like Lonnie Chisenhall, who plays right field for the Indians. Roberto Perez, their catcher. Their center field platoon with Tyler Naquin and Rajay Davis. Coco Crisp coming off the bench as well. This is a very well-rounded group. A number of guys, Brandon Guyer, a right-handed hitting corner outfielder off their bench. They can match up with you pretty well. So I think this is a very underappreciated, underrated group of Indian hitters. Also, in terms of bench, this is a pretty even matchup in my opinion. I think this is kind of a wash because both managers have a number of platoon options that they can go to, whether it's guys like Chris Coghlan and then the recently activated Kyle Schwarber for the Cubs, who's going to DH tonight. Joe Maddon obviously likes to mix and match based on who's on the mound. Same with Terry Francona. They're very similar managers. So with the Indians lineup, some of the guys that I mentioned, Naquin and Crisp and Davis, Chisenhall, you see those guys mix it up. They have a number of players that they use off their bench. Right now, the Indians are a pretty deep ball club, and they will mix and match as well. Their bench is more outfielder heavy. The Cubs have more utility guys, but both are used effectively, so that's why I made that a wash. Based on how they're used, I think they're pretty equal in the type of threat that they pose to the opposing ball clubs. In terms of managers in this series, I haven't really been critical of Joe Maddon per se. I think he's an excellent manager. I've just been critical of the constant ass kissing by members of the media and some of the quote unquote Theobot Cubs fans out there. I guess you can call them Madden bots as well, or however you want to phrase that. Maybe overzealous in their praise of these guys, but if you get rid of that and all the media hype and all that stuff, if you get down to it, Joe Maddon truly is one of the best managers in baseball. He's on a very short list in that regard, not just of how he uses the information that he receives from the Cubs front office, but his ability to work with different personalities, different egos, and how to just in-game management, making the right moves, lineup construction to really optimize the productivity from the lineup on a daily basis. He does have a pretty quick hook, but that's pretty standard for the game in 2016. So yeah, no, he's every bit the great manager that people say he is. It's just sometimes kind of annoying to hear it. On the other hand, Terry Francona, I'm sure he'll be extremely fired up to face his old employer, Theo Epstein, his old boss. He's an excellent manager in his own right. He's won 2 World Series rings, very accomplished manager, back in the World Series for the 3rd time in his career. I think he's on his way to the Hall of Fame. The way he's managed to get the Tribe back to elite status in this league, it's truly amazing, because I remember when he first got hired in the 2012-2013 offseason, and it seemed like the Indians were pretty far away from this point. He's been very instrumental in getting them there with guys who aren't considered star players. So for me, these are 2 great managers. I've got nothing but good things to say about them, regardless of how I feel about how they're talked about in the national and local media. So you're talking about 2 great managers. For me, this is a wash. I don't think you can really underestimate the job that these guys have done, and I think that Theo there, Madden is capable of matching every move of Tito that other AL managers couldn't match, and then of course Tito is more than capable of matching every move that Madden makes that other NL managers couldn't match. So this matchup of managers is as good as you'll see even in the World Series. So for me, I've got Cubs offense with the edge, Cubs starting pitching with the edge, bench wash, managers wash, and bullpen Indians. I believe this will be a 6 or 7 game series. This is a very close one to call, but I do like the home field for the Indians. The Cubs have been pretty much unstoppable at Wrigley. I think this is a straight home field advantage World Series where the Indians will win all 4 games in Progressive Field, and the Cubs will win all 3 games at Wrigley. This will be a 7-game series, and it'll play out as if the Minnesota Twins were playing at the old Metrodome, where you win games 1 and 2 at home, lose 3, 4, and 5 on the road, and 6 and 7 back home in your own ballpark. So I've got the Indians winning in 7 games. I think the MVP of the series will be my guy from the north suburbs, Jason Kipnis. He's had a really solid postseason to date. Had a great division series, not a great offensive series against Toronto, but was still a pretty effective player and has had a really good season so far. I envision them pitching to him before they challenge Lindor in the 3 spot, so I think hitting in the 2 hole will really benefit Kipnis, especially if guys are on base ahead of him. So that's why I'm picking Jason Kipnis to win the MVP of this series. He's also, being a North Suburban native, he is a Cubs fan, or at least he was growing up, so he's going to have that extra motivation coming in, as will Terry Francona, because he's going up against his old boss, Theo Epstein. You're talking about 2 very motivated ball clubs playing against each other. They're both trying to end very, very long droughts of World Series championships or lack thereof. So I expect this to be nothing other than a great World Series. But I am going American League here, and I am picking the Tribe to beat the Cubs in 7 games. So that concludes my preview for the 2016 World Series. As we stand, we're about an hour and 15 minutes away from first pitch. I hope everybody out there, whether you're a Cubs or Sox fan or a fan of any other team in the big leagues, enjoys this World Series. I think it's going to be a very long 7-game barn burner classic type World Series. This should be very enjoyable to watch regardless of who you're rooting for. So for my executive producer, Kevin McGrath, this is your host, Ben Jacks, signing off as we head into the 2016 World Series. Thank you very much, and have a good night.